Hey everyone, what's up? So today we're going to be taking a special early look at the latest update for Once Human titled The Way of Winter. I've been playing this over the past week as Starry Studios reached out asking to sponsor a video where I would showcase what they are calling their biggest update ever. Now, if you didn't know, I played a ton of Once Human when the game first came out. I have a review of my 160 hour playthrough. Really genuinely enjoyed my time with it and was interested in seeing what has changed and what they've added here. I figured with the thing's name being The Way of Winter and the pitch it was them introducing some new survival mechanics, I just assumed that this update would just be like Once Human exactly as I remember, but with a temperature gauge you have to pay attention to or something, right? But boy, was that far from the reality. Turns out that yes, this is the same baseline game. It's got the same gathering, crafting, and building systems, the same basic combat and progression loops, and yes, there is a new temperature related mechanic among other things, but on top of that, the whole thing takes place in an entirely new play space. Yes, a brand new map separate from the one I spent nearly 200 hours in when the game launched last July. So The Way of Winter takes place in the snowy realm on the far northern edge of Once Human's island. Here are three major regions, the Vena Fjord, Onyx Tundra, and Ember Strand, a blending of frozen mountains and active volcanoes that comes together to create the extreme temperatures that you have to mitigate for this season with the help of a few new tools. Now, in these areas are all of the expected assortment of towns, settlements, silos, and monolith bosses, a majority of which is also entirely new. Yes, a lot of the baseline enemies you're fighting are the same, along with some new additions, and there are a couple of repeat silos, dungeons, and monolith bosses, but outside of that, the entire play space itself, the zones, and then every single settlement, which are those open world enemy camps that you go in and clear, all of that stuff is 100% brand new. And everything about this area is large, like from the size of the zone itself, the actual physical play space, which appears to be as big as all of the zones the game launched with combined, but then also the scale of a lot of the settlements within that zone. Some of these are like 4 to 5 times the size of what the game has had up until this point. They're just humongously big spaces and areas to explore. So yes, if you played Once Human at release, this whole map that you remember playing, that is not in this season. All of this is new. All right, so let me walk you through some of the various features, the new content, and areas that you can explore in The Way of Winter. So you start out going through the same intro tutorial that you remember. You'll make your character, be introduced to the movement, combat, the basics of gathering, crafting, and the deviant system. But then this time, when you step through that door, you will find yourself falling into a whole new world. The game actually lets you pick which of the first 2 zones you want to spawn into. I went with the far eastern most region, the Onyx Tundra, as that's what they suggest for beginners. And then pretty much immediately, once you land, you're introduced to the new temperature mechanic. So let's talk about this. As a baseline, the whole region that you start out in is going to be cold, and you have to mitigate those lower temperatures using a variety of methods. Now, in the beginning, what they do is they share with you the fact that you can craft some basic weather-resistant gear, you can carry around a torch, and you can consume some of the nearby spicy plants, all of which will raise your temperature slightly. There is a gauge just under the minimap that tells you the exact current temperature, with a whole bunch of environmental factors playing into this. So it is going to get colder or warmer depending on what area of the map that you are in, and then also what is going on. And a lot of this just makes intuitive sense. So yes, it'll be colder at the top of a snowy mountain than it is when you're standing in the middle of a green valley. But then also the temperature is going to go down during nighttime after the sun sets. There are actually physical storms that come in and can blanket the ground in a few inches of snow, which makes things colder. And then there are these world bosses called Chaos Weavers. They're pretty much massive air conditioners. They're these towering creatures. They're found across the map in various locations, and they will lower the surrounding temperature in a rather large circumference. I think it's 10 degrees Celsius, which again, if your weather resistance isn't up to that, then that's going to become a survival mechanic where you have to get out in time. But on the flip side, though, things warm up as well. So things are going to get warmer if you're near thermal springs. During the daytime, it gets warmer when the sun is out, and it eventually becomes unbearably hot once you start to progress into those volcanic regions. And both the heat and the cold will cause your internal temperature to fluctuate, which can put you into either hypothermia or give you a heat stroke, both of which will eventually kill you if not dealt with. So outside of the initial method that we mentioned for keeping yourself warmer, like crafting that basic thermal gear, carrying a torch, and eating spicy plants, there are many more ways to modify your temperature. You can actually craft what are these stones that you put in your backpack. There's a heat stone and a cold stone that will either keep you warm or cool you off. You can build campfires and stoves to keep yourself warmer. You can make specialized food to warm up or cool down. It's going to be much more effective than eating the raw ingredients. And there's even things like portable air conditioners and heating units you can bring around with you. And then beyond all of these basic layers that you'll be interacting with, the entire season gets progressively more intense as it progresses. So in phase 1, the temperature systems are moderate enough so that you can easily manage them with the basic intro tools given. Moving into the final phases of the season, the temperatures get so extreme, it actually requires coordinated effort to survive with other players on your server. So as a player, you can construct what are called these thermal towers that when they're built, they impact the surrounding temperature in a massive vicinity. So later on in the season, having these spread across the map is actually going to be vital for your survival, for the survival of yourself and the other people. And you're going to even have to defend these from being attacked by those Chaos Weavers. So initially the Chaos Weavers are just something that makes the nearby area cool. Eventually they're going to be trying to destroy your thermal towers. And that is just like the basic introductory overview to the thermal tower system. We didn't get to play through all the phases of the season because that takes like several weeks. There's definitely a lot more depth to the system as well. Okay, so that's the new weather and temperature mechanics, but beyond managing that, you're going to be doing essentially the same basic things that you did in Once Human the first time around. You're going to go around gathering resources that you use to craft armor, weapons, consumables, and build your own base. You'll be visiting towns to speak with the game's NPCs to pick up and progress both the main and various side story quests. And then in doing that, in going through this process, you're also going to go around visiting the various points of interest, which mainly consist of those settlements, the silos, and the monoliths. So now let's talk about those. Settlements seem to be way more expansive this time around. Some really cool locations. Here's some of my favorites that I saw. There's a theme park called Wishland, and I'm not just talking like a video game theme park that has like a Ferris wheel and a merry-go-round. No, this is an honest to goodness massive theme park. It's broken up into different lands. There is a castle, a full-blown museum, there's a zoo, an aquarium, and then all sorts of themed rides throughout those. It's even got a roller coaster that goes through the entire theme park, and you can jump on and ride it whenever you want with various stops in each of the different sections of the park. I mean, it is literally a full-blown theme park. It's got a gift shop with things for you to buy and everything. It's hilarious. There's also the military compounds, a lot of these in the base game, but one that was particularly cool in this expansion area was the Hive Rail restricted area. So when you first approach it, you're just going to see your typical mix of the military buildings and the NPCs in front shooting you and sending their drone robots after you. But as you push further into it, you eventually come across in the center this excavation that's taking place with what I would describe as like this crazy other dimensional rock biomass formation that's spiraling high up into the sky along the edge of this mountain. This thing was humongous, and it's got the game's like creepy enemy faction that spawns out of pods, a bunch of these creatures all running around. And then also in the dead center of the map, it's this big towering mountain, right? There's actually a monolith boss at the very top of the mountain with a long winding path that you have to take to reach up there. But then while on that path, as you're spiraling up, there's actually a few cliff sides, and if you happen to look and jump over one of them, all of a sudden you will discover what is this absurdly large cavern. Essentially, the entire middle of the mountain is hollowed out, forming a huge cave system. It's multi-layered. It goes all the way down from the top to the bottom of the mountain. There's zip lines you can use to traverse from one ledge to another. Enemies in various locations. In fact, in one corner, there's the tall flowerhead boss enemy that you can fight. And then all throughout, there's a bunch of loot that you can collect between chests and then loot that you just find in the environment for scavenging for materials. Some other neat settlements that I came across in my playtime included the Frisker Harbor. This is basically a working dock. It's covered in mist though from the cool and warm air meeting in the center of the map. There's the Scavenger faction, has this base called Obsidian Camp that's built inside and then wrapping up and around this big mountain in the southeast corner, I believe it was, and a bunch more other settlements. But what's what stood out to me the most here was just how large some of these areas are. Again, like I said, like 4 to 5 times the size of the settlements that were in the base launch version of Once Human are found here. There's some securement silos. A new one is called Delta. It's these tight corridors with like a bunch of fire damage dealing enemies inside. And then the boss fight takes place on a massive drum with the boss starting out on stage playing an electric guitar, and you have to fight him while also trying to avoid the damage from the huge hands with the drumsticks. And then a couple of the base game version silos are actually ported into this region, like the EX1 silo. That's the one that with the prison with that cool red light green light mechanic that takes place in a room, but also in the final boss fight. They basically moved it up into the northern area for the new region for this season. And then Monolith bosses, a couple of repeats here as well, in addition to a brand new one, which is the Sector Servitor. So this fight takes place in a large circular arena with 4 pillars of lights in each corner. When you're not standing in the light, you get this passively stacking debuff, and then once it reaches a certain threshold, you actually start taking a bunch of ticking damage. Now you can cleanse that debuff by standing near one of those light pillars. The problem though is at the same time you're trying to fight the boss, and he is constantly throwing out area damage at you that forces you away from those light pillars. Like there'll be a tornado that follows you, he'll put damage pools on the ground you can't stand in, there'll be these massive projectile attacks that he launches, and then even summons up a rain cloud that follows you around and damages you if it hits you. So yeah, the whole fight is you balancing trying to actually damage the boss while cleansing the debuff by standing in the light, but then being forced out of the light from the various sources of area damage that the boss is tossing at you at the same time. It was actually a pretty interesting fight. It took us a minute to get our bearings and figure it out, but yeah, pretty cool. Now when you're moving through the map, you're going to the settlements, checking out the various points of interest, fighting enemies. There's also a bunch of various puzzles and new traversal things that you'll come across. So for example, it's the big frozen region, and there's ice all over the place, and part of this ice is actually interactable. Like you will find these pillars of ice that you can toss a Molotov cocktail at, and then that fire damage will melt the ice, revealing a collectible resource underneath. There's even like walls that would be blocked off by ice that you can break with your physical torch or by tossing a molly at it. You can use these light sources to destroy shadow barriers. You'll come across essentially shadow walls of sorts, and you'll have to find a light switch or a generator for a particular kind of special light that is used to destroy those barriers. In fact, this light source is also used to take on these new shadow creatures that were introduced into the game. A lot more jumping puzzles than I remember from the base game to get up to higher areas. There are the ones where you find those floating purple things and you interact with it, and it starts like a mini chain where you go from one purple thing to another, and then after you do like 3 or 4 of those, a special chest spawns. They also introduced zip lines into the game. They're at various locations, and it's just a zip line. You walk up to it, you hit F, it takes you from one end all the way to the other, and there's some areas where there's just tons of zip lines all over the place. And it actually is cool because you can use the momentum like of the speed from the zip line and then jumping off and gliding to get like a faster glide speed, which I thought was neat. And then also a bunch of giant trees with platforms all around them. We'll be interested to see what you can do with it. But yeah, it's just like big old trees with platforms and ladders going up to them. Now, as a baseline, you're going to be fighting the same combination and mixture of enemy types that you did in the base game, but there are some new inclusions as well. So the factions of like the scavenger faction, the human NPCs, kind of rough and tumble style, they've got a bunch of new variations of what there were in the base game. There's also a bunch of new wildlife in the game. Like we saw these mutated bears. At one point, we even saw these cosmic space bears during a world event, which was cool. I came across this mirror guy. So he's one of those creepy deviants, and he's just holding up a big mirror, and in the front, he's immune to damage. So you actually have to get up, around, or flanking him in some way to damage behind the mirror to actually kill him. There's all those shadow enemies. We talked about that light source. So basically, you'll take like the normal versions of enemies. There's just shadow variants that will not take damage from throwables like grenades or weapons. You have to damage them with this special light that's found throughout the environment. And I do believe there's a deviation that you can use as well to deal with these. And then there's those Chaos Weavers that I told you about, those massive towering mechanical creatures that are giant AC units lowering the temperature. These things seem like we tried taking on one of them, and we had pretty good gear at the time, but we were barely tickling it. So I think it's going to take either super gear or a lot of players to take one of these things down. Bunch of new pets in the game known as the deviations. There's actually 7 new deviations that will be found in this scenario, and they're going to help with all sorts of things. So you got the territory helpers like Tar Pudding, who extracts crude oil. Hydronaut fish gathers clean water. The ice bottle makes ice cubes for new consumables. And then there's the night watch lamp, which will actually guard your territory, your base. And then there's a few new combat deviations. Snapshot will debuff enemies, increasing weapon damage they receive. The external sun does area burn damage. And then there's Winter Spirit, the one that I'm using right now, which like summons crystals, doing frost damage and debuffing enemies. There's also been some crafting changes. So generally, the blueprint and crafting system are mostly the same from what you remember, but they've now added the ability to put additional perks onto gear depending on the type of hide that you use while you're crafting it. So different sources of hide will come with different effects. For example, using reindeer hide will add damage reduction to your helm, cold resist to your chest and legs, mushroom gathering yield to your gloves, maximum load increase to your boots, and increased melee damage to your mask. And there's a lot of different hide sources, not only changing with the animal, but also where the animal came from. Like there's multiple deer types and just multiple of all sorts of different animals. And then with each of those comes its own variation of the perks. So while the reindeer hide will increase the maximum load on your boots, if you use other hides on your boots, you're going to get deer hide gives you more sprint speed. The tundra deer hide gives you stamina cost reduction. Wolf skin on boots gives you base move speed. Rabbit fur gives you jump height. Wool gives you climb speed. Croc hide gives you roll speed. Cow hide gives you maximum stamina, and many more. And those are just some examples of the different hides just for boots. All of those different hide sources have different effects on all of the other gear slots as well. Really cool inclusion for just some additional customization into gear crafting. All right, so like prior seasons, the Way of Winter will be broken up into multiple phases, with each of them unlocking more and new content while also ramping up the extreme weather and requiring more mitigation. So the first phase, Arctic Domain, it has the Venya Fjord and Onyx Tundra regions available with all of their points of interest, the settlements, silos, towns, and monoliths. At this point, the weather is going to be moderate and easy to deal with. Then in phase 2, Scattered Ash, they will be opening up the Ember Strand zones, which are on the far western portion of the map. That, of course, has all of its points of interest, its settlements, silos, towns, and monoliths. The weather then worsens at this phase, and you have to deal with much more of the heat, trying to keep yourself cool. In phase 3, A Glimmer of Hope, the Dungeon Pro mode opens up. The weather starts to get more severe, requiring use of those thermal towers. And then in phase 4, the End of Ice and Fire. This is when they open up the Frost and Flame event, and at this point the weather will be extreme and very hard to survive. And that pretty much does it for our preview and overview of Once Human's upcoming The Way of Winter update. Hopefully this gives you a good picture of what it's all about. I'll say that this was far beyond what I imagined for a new season. The fact that they have added an entirely brand new massive zone with all new points of interest, it's just simply more than I expected. And really what I'm going to be most interested in as well is in the future going forward, how they merge this new area and these new systems with the areas that were in the base game as well. I'm really keen to see when we get to that point. But either way, really interesting new season. A lot more changes than, like I said, than I expected. Thanks once again to Starry Studios for sponsoring today's video. If you would like to learn more or check out Once Human for yourself, you can use the link in the video description below. The Way of Winter will be launching officially on October 17th. Thank you as always for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. See y'all next time.